welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. This podcast is of course free, but to ensure it continues, it does require support. If you can support the show and its continued research, there are a number of tiers to choose from, starting from £1 a month at patreon.com/the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. From the Fairy Folk tier upwards, you'll have access to my monthly path workings, which are led meditation visualizations. These aid inner journeying. With your support, I'm hoping to dedicate more time to this research and producing fortnightly podcast episodes. If you can't afford to support, then please do rate the podcast, and it would be a great help if you can share your favourite episodes with your friends. Thank you. Thanks for joining me for number 12, the final episode of Series 1. Feels like a real milestone. To mark the end of our first set of explorations into the unknown, we're joined by special guest Dr Neil Rushton, author and fairy experience investigator. As well as talking around my various musings during this series, Neil shares his own experiences. He also offers his perspective on why and how people see fairies and how this differs to the reductionist, materialist worldview on the matter. Neil's blog site, deadbutdreaming.wordpress.com, is an excellent resource that I'd recommend you check out. His articles cover fairy-associated folklore as well as some deeper digs into the connection between fairy encounters and altered states. There are some books mentioned in the course of our conversation, and these, along with some other suggested reading material, is on my show notes at scarletofthefae.com, where you'll also find links to Neil's blog, to his 2 novels too. It was really great to chat to him and hear his perspective on all of this, and as always, I love to hear your thoughts on all of this too. Thank you for your messages and emails. It always makes my day to hear from you. You can contact me via my website at scarletofthefae.com and tweet me at _remain_curious. As this is the last episode of the series, I'll be back at the end with some very exciting news about a very special bonus episode, a big reveal, and how you can take part in forming what Series 2 might look like. Enjoy and see you at the end. Time to For this episode, I'm really excited to have with me Dr. Neil Rushton. Neil's written 2 novels which feature fairy encounters, and he researches fairy folklore, particularly from esoteric perspectives, some of these achieved through altered states of consciousness. So you've got quite a lot of interest in that, Neil, haven't you? So welcome.
Hello, Jo.
Hello. Because we have spoken before, haven't we, quite a few years ago now, when
Yes.
When we were kind of first starting out, when Mark Norman and I were researching for Simon Young's book, Magical Folk, British and Irish Fairies, 500 AD to the present, giving its full title. But at that time, it was quite early on, and I think at that point we were setting up the Facebook group, Modern Fairy Sightings, and we had a really good chat back then and exchanged experiences. And we've sort of stayed in touch since then, haven't we? And I don't know about you, but it seems to me that there's just more and more interest in this subject.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think that must have been 2016.
Yeah.
When, as you say, what you were setting up at the time, and I was at that time just setting up my blog site called Dead But Dreaming, where I had decided to write a series of articles. Didn't know how many I was going to write or what perspective I was going to come from, but it soon became clear through 2016 that I wanted to come at it from a very, as you say, esoteric viewpoint, I spent many years before that looking at the folklore as you need to understand at quite a fundamental level the historical folklore of a phenomenon such as the fairies. And you've got to understand it in order to then start building upon it. And certainly before you start to look at modern encounters and how the phenomenon has morphed into something else over the last maybe decade or so, well, maybe a couple of decades. And you're right, there has, I've noticed, certainly since 2016, a great increase in the number of websites, Facebook pages, social media type accounts, as well as books.
Yes.
About the subject, all of them coming from slightly different perspectives, but a lot of those people will be plugging into the more esoteric elements of fairy folklore and the modern fairy phenomenon, I think.
Yeah, that is really true. Do you have any ideas why that might be, that people have suddenly had a surge of interest in fairies?
I think it's something like a snowball effect, where you have a phenomenon which is a long-standing, centuries-old, maybe even millennia-old phenomenon, such as the fairies. And partly due to the internet and the ease of communication now, and partly because a few people started to look at it from different angles, from more esoteric angles. And once a few people do it, other people who are also interested in that different perspective, myself included, will start to tag on, will read what they've got to say or listen to what they have to say, and then realize, actually, I can take this a little bit further, either through my own experiences or my own research, my own reading. And like I say, there's a snowball effect. And I think that's happened, facilitated by the internet over the last decade or so. And now, well, if you went looking for this stuff 10 years ago, there was very little on the internet. And there were a few books, Patrick Harper springs to mind, Graham Hancock, these kind of writers who were investigating the phenomena, but they were few and far between. Now, if you go on to the internet and you go into a search engine and you put fairies, you will come up, you are able to go quite a long way down the rabbit hole.
Absolutely. And at the same time as well, I would say maybe in the last kind of 15 years as well, it got really commercial. I mean, I know there's always been a massive commercial side to it anyway, but the whole kind of fairy doors and fairy walks and I mean, in that respect, I feel it's it's quite sweet because it's drawing people back into nature and encouraging children. Sometimes that might be the way to get your kid out the door for a walk, is the promise of finding fairy doors. But that got really huge as well. But what I've noticed since 2016, when Mark and I were researching down for we had the Devon chapter, Fairies in Devon, and
yes,
we went across Dartmoor and we were putting up posters in pubs and cafes with an illustration of a fairy man that my husband drew, with words underneath, "Have you seen this man?" And we didn't really get much comeback from that, just kind of strange looks from people. We were sort of encouraging people to get in touch with fairy experiences. But I did speak to a couple of people at the time down there and heard some interesting encounters. But it was when we got back and set up the group, it was slow to start. And I've always been really careful about letting people into the group, very mindful about what's being shared and said on there. But in the last, say, 3 years particularly, it has just ballooned, and we've got well over 4,000 members, but lots more people wanting to share, people eager to tell their stories or feeling safe enough to tell their stories without fear of ridicule. But I think what's really lovely as well is the support that the other members of the group provide to that person who is sharing all. And what people remark is it's just a massive relief to be able to do that. And that's how the podcast, it serves that purpose really, is for somewhere to be able to share their story and for it to be witnessed. Yeah,
no, absolutely. It's there's certainly been an exponential growth, not just in the Modern Fairy Sightings page, but other similar kinds of pages. My own on Facebook called the Fairy Code. It's people over the last year or so, I would say there's suddenly, if you were looking at a graph, there would be a sudden upcurve in the numbers of people interested in it. And what you're saying, maybe this is another example of the snowball effects, in that when people see other people start to explain and discuss experiences which previously would have been maybe not taboo, but they'd have been afraid of sharing them for the sake of ridicule. And as soon as half a dozen people do it, then another dozen people do it, and then 24 people do it, and then you've got hundreds of people who suddenly think, right, it's okay, it's a legitimate thing to talk about. And so I think that's partly the explanation for that kind of growth. I think there's also another variable, another possible explanation for it, in that certainly in these times, the last few years, and especially the last year, I think people are looking for purpose and meaning, and that will often include some elements of spirituality. So obviously we're talking about the fairies, but you could look at other variables which include spirituality of one form or another. So there's a slight uptick in people getting interested in certain religions. That's sort of the obvious way to go, isn't it? But there's also an uptick in other esoteric phenomenon. So I'm thinking most especially of the UFO phenomenon, which has dramatically the interest in it, a number of people talking seriously about it, not just unfounded woo-woo. We're talking about people who are doing some real quality research, and a lot more people are getting interested in it in the same way as they are for the fairies, because people are starting to think that there's more to this world than some reductionist, materialist outlook, which at root is quite nihilistic. There's got to be more. And I think that's another reason for the upsurge in interest.
Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com. That is really interesting. I mean, I don't know whether you've heard me talk about this on one of the episodes, because I know I have brought it up before. But, there's this idea that when we get to a certain position in our evolution where we move away from that kind of ego-based Western society as we see it, power plays and control, when we move more into we are one planetary consciousness, once we have let go of our ego as a planetary consciousness, we might be ready to connect with, communities in the universe outside of our own. That could be within our own Earth and whatever worlds exist there, and also in outer space. And I know that does sound very woo-woo, but to a lot of people, but to me it makes sense. And I just wonder if this is a point in our evolution as humans where we do get over ourselves and start to take these ideas of other worlds more seriously. That's not to say that, we're finding it ourselves, of course. This isn't a top-down, this is a bottom-up thing. We're finding it ourselves. Yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think it's woo-woo at all. It's a very reasonable explanation of what might be going on. You could come at it from a slightly different angle and talk about Carl Jung's collective unconscious, where, or whatever you want to call it, the Akashic records, or a collective of all human experience. And once that builds up to a certain level, perhaps there's a tipping point. And maybe there have been many tipping points in human history. And this is another one where you get a certain number of people plugging into that collective unconscious at one level, but also the build-up within that collective consciousness, which I was going to say force a change. I don't think it's going to force a change. It's just going to be a tip over into people perhaps understanding new realities. And this can work in many ways. What we've been talking about, people becoming more interested in esoteric subjects, but think about something as hard science as quantum physics, which, although quantum mechanics has been around for 100 years, in the last couple of decades, once again, some of the completely crazy ideas that have come out from the smallest things we know about, such as the double slit experiment and quantum entanglement, these things do not match a reductionist, materialist, clockwork universe. They are outside of it. The basic pixels of life operate differently than they should within that materialistic worldview. Now, that takes a while to filter down from experimental laboratory work and theoretical physics into the general populace. Most people 20 years ago knew nothing about quantum physics, whereas now there are hundreds of books aimed at a popular audience trying to explain what the madness of the quantum world means for us. And they're written by scientists, by philosophers, and general researchers. And so that's just another example of that snowball effect, where you've got so many people interested in, and to my mind, what I understand about certain elements of quantum physics, it's more woo-woo than the fairies.
Yeah, I need to look more into that. But these are the sorts of forces that might explain things like healing and other realities, where one moment, you are suffering with some condition, and then through those forces and through alternate realities, if you have two people joining their consciousness together to achieve that shared view of what that new reality might be, then you have somebody moments later who is healed from whatever ailment they had.
Well, I don't want to go on the hard sell here, but in my second novel called Dead But Dreaming, that's exactly what happens. I mean, because it's fictional novel, there's a creepy element to it as well. But that idea of going into someone else's consciousness,
Yes,
in order to heal them from whatever issue that may be, it's still science fiction at this stage. But
not for some people though, who practice it all the time.
well, exactly, and they do it in different ways, as you
Yeah.
know much better than I do. But it's, if you try to explain that to your basic layperson, they would think, no, that cannot possibly be true, because they've basically been, this is a bit of a strong word, but they've been indoctrinated into that reductionism, where that sort of thing cannot happen. And so just a quick step back to quantum physics. That's why I think quantum physics and what we know about it at this stage is so important, because people know, oh, it's hard science, that must be real. And then they find out what quantum physics is saying, and it's, oh my goodness, the world isn't as we thought it was.
Exactly.
So that's, one route into it. And at the level we're talking about today, about a phenomenon such as the fairies, the fact that more and more people are talking about it makes it more and more acceptable, and more people will, I'm going to find out, I'm going to get a book, or I'm going to go onto a website and just inform myself, because there are so many people talking about it. It can't be as crazy as I once maybe thought it was.
Yeah, I think so. And also what I think is really important here is our relationship with nature. And I know there's a lot of really brilliant academics out there doing a lot of work around this as well, one of them being Dr. Jack Hunter. I'm really inspired by the work that he is doing at the moment.
Yeah, Jack is great.
Yeah, and I think that at the one end of the spectrum, you could say you've got some kind of hard science going on with quantum physics, and that there are some books that you can read to get to through those studies you could start to understand more. At the other end, you can literally just go out and experience things for yourself, just to feel for yourself what it's all about. And you might not necessarily experience a fairy, but just by going out into nature, which again a lot of people have been doing more over this last year, they're feeling something. It might just be birdsong, but they are receiving it in a different way than they did before. It's almost like away from the kind of crazy world that we've come from, and all of the rush and all of the busyness and all of the non-stop modern Western society. The stopping of that cycle and this kind of liminal space we're in, people are looking for more meaning. And the easiest way in which to do that is to just step into nature, to go for a walk. And of course, more and more people are doing that because it's now brilliantly, it's part of a lot of well-being programs.
Well, in terms of well-being, being out in nature is pretty much universal agreement that it will do you good. And just two things to say. The last year of lockdown, I think it could go either way. You've got lots of people have got more time, and if they're lucky enough to have some sort of natural environment that they can easily get to, then they probably have been taking advantage of it more and realizing the benefits of it. The flip side of that is, if you don't have a natural environment on your doorstep that it's as easy access, you can retreat from the natural environment. So where you may have once caught a train for half an hour and walked in a wood, for the last year or most of the last year, you haven't really been able to do that. And so there's been a retreat for some people. No idea what the percentages are either way, but that it can work both ways. The second thing, what you're saying about getting out and experiencing things directly, this is actually quite a fundamentally important point in what we're talking about, certainly in terms of the podcasts, which are all direct experiences. I usually call it gnosis. That direct experience of something is the only way that you will ever really know it. And once we've had that experience, no one can take it away from you. No one can rationalize it. No one can, they may try to explain it away to you, but you know that you've had it. And even if it's as simple as, like you say, hearing birdsong in the woods, where maybe you've never stopped to listen to that before, that will have that has the potential to have a transformatory effect on you. And of course, if you get to a more numinous experience, such as encountering non-human intelligent entities, well, no one's going to be able to take that away from you, because you have experienced it directly. It's not someone telling you a story about it. You've had the experience. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, that's so true. What I find, from talking to people on the podcast, what's been really wonderful, and I've loved each and every chat that I've had, because they're all so different. There's something that ties them all together. I think the people that I've spoken to have just been so lovely and open-hearted as well. And, it does make me wonder whether that is an aid to seeing fairies, to be so open like that. Maybe it's an openness to new experience. Maybe it's an openness to life itself. I'm not sure.
I think there are many, very many components to this about why people experience this type of phenomenon. One of the things that I talk about regularly is how many of these experiences seem to involve being in an altered state of consciousness. Now, that can come in so many forms. So from the simple thing of just being relaxed, we've just been talking about going out in woodlands. If you live in a city and you go to a lovely woodland, you are likely to be in an altered state of consciousness from your regular everyday consciousness. And then you can get the more purposeful or accidental altered states of consciousness, such as if you're meditating, if you have some kind of trauma, you have some kind of illness, something like temporal lobe epilepsy, or if you purposely change your state of consciousness by taking a psychotropic. So those are on a kind of a line of extremities in terms of how you alter your consciousness. But so often, and even in the podcasts, how many have you done? 11, is it?
11, yeah.
I think everyone I've listened to, they have been in an altered state of consciousness in some way. They've either been relaxed, they're feeling unhappy, or they're nervous about something. It can work both ways. And as far as I'm aware, none of them were taking psychotropics or purposely meditating, but they could have been in a meditative state. And as soon as this happens, there's the possibility that reducing valve in your brain, as Aldous Huxley called it, is tweaked. And things that are not normally let in, probably for good reason, because you can't live your everyday life on this planet if these type of things are always happening. But it just allows that to happen. And I think it can happen to anyone. I don't think, there probably are special people. There are clairvoyants, there are seers, there are people who are just more attuned to this and will experience these type of phenomena more often. I think that's definitely true. But I also think it's true that anyone can experience this type of numinosity at whatever level. And it's because their normal states of consciousness are being altered, whether a little bit or radically.
Well, yes, and it seems that it's innate. It's within us to be able to see these beings and to reach altered states, and but we're very much snapped out of them. I mean, I remember as a kid at school, I often think about it. It's a bit strange, really, but I think I was about 6 or 7, and we were doing a Roman project, And I suddenly just went off into this daydream, and just, seeing myself back there, and this whole story kind of unfolding in my mind. And I was just deep in this daydream of being back in Roman times, and I got slapped on the leg by my teacher, because back in the day, in the 80s,
I remember well.
You could get slapped, and it was so shocking to my whole being, and I was obviously humiliated and upset, but it was really, really shocking. And this is something that happens, not necessarily being snapped, but you're snapped out of daydreaming when you're a kid, if you're in that sort of situation. Instead, you might have parents that might encourage the daydreaming and encourage the exploration of your imagination, or just some kids that are just allowed to go off and play in nature, or to go off and play with their toys for hours on ends, and just really, really getting into their imagination. Those are definitely altered states. Or even, when you're a kid and you are really ill. When we were going through all our childhood illnesses as a kid, I can remember having really crazy hallucinations, but very, very vivid, and talking to the people in my hallucinations, but being able to talk to my parents about it. So if you can, if these strange states of consciousness, or altered states of consciousness, are accepted at some level, it becomes interesting for you as you throughout your life. But if it's really switched off and seen as something that is to be quashed, then ultimately you're going to shut that off.
Well, that can happen at many levels, can't it? You're talking about the usual thing in childhood. We tend in our society to allow kids up to a certain age you almost encourage things like imaginary friends, or them seeing fairies and playing with fairies. It's encouraged to a certain age, and then you get to a certain age, I don't know what that age is, but you need to stop now, because you need to become acculturated to social norms. And in our present society, it is not a social norm to be seeing entities of whatever sort that other people can't see. And even what you said about when you were a child and you were seeing, you were hallucinating, you describe it as hallucinating. Well, how do you know you were hallucinating? It's the hallucinatory, the very word itself is used a lot, not just for children, but for people who for many different reasons have experience and interaction with entities of whatever sort. And the usual explanation, you're hallucinating. I've written quite a lot about the fact that I don't think much of this is hallucination. I think some of it is more fundamental than that.
Well, I've very much enjoyed your 2 novels. I think the second one, you really are able to step into that. It's very vivid, and you really kind of get into the journey.
Well, thank you for saying that, Jo. It's very, very kind. It's
that's Dead But Dreaming.
Dead But Dreaming is the novel that came out last year. So it's, well, I'm not going to explain it at all, but if people are interested in fairy folklore and more kind of psychological way of looking at altered states of consciousness and entity contact and mind to mind, consciousness to consciousness interaction, that's what the story is all about. I had to write it I had to set it in 1970 so that I could get loads of really good prog rock music.
Could have an accompanying CD or something with or playlist on Spotify or something.
Few people have said that. I'd absolutely love it, but someone would have to pay for it to be done, so it probably won't happen. But so that's what I like to explore. And the first novel, which was 5 years ago, that was a bit more vicious, to be honest. I was getting quite a lot of not very pleasant things from within me, outside of me, in order to put into that novel. And it's if anyone came to me who was interested in things such as fairies or altered states of consciousness, entity contact, numinous experiences, etc., I'd always point them to the second book. I've got quite a lot more to say about the fairies. It's an ongoing exploration and understanding for me to find out about them, not just the folklore, which is, you'll never get completely on top of the folklore. There's so much of it. You just need to understand as much as you can. But I will probably concentrate much more on writing about the more esoteric elements of the fairies in researched articles on my blog site and in articles and book chapters, etc. I think that's probably what I need to do for the next couple of years, because I feel as though I'm not quite at the stage where I have a reasonably worked out interpretation for exactly what they are, where they're coming from, and why we're interacting with them. And that might never happen, but I feel as though I can get a little bit closer to it. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, your blog site is absolutely brilliant. A really, really excellent resource. Just chipping in here to say that Neil's blog is at deadbutdreaming.wordpress.com. Great to read. I mean, it's a fabulous resource. You've done so much great work on there, and it's so useful.
Well, I try to, the articles themselves needs to have a kind of academic quality to them, but I've purposely, so I rarely use references. All the references are inbuilt hyperlinks, because I don't want to be pretending to be writing academic articles. I've done that in my past. I know how to do it, but I don't think it's appropriate and not as useful to do that. And I think most people, sure, some academics are looking at it, but most people don't want to see every sentence referenced to an obscure book that they're never going to be able to find anyway. They want the hyperlinks. They want to be able to go elsewhere, but they want a well-researched article which is academic in tone, but also slightly journalistic in tone, so that they can get through whatever, some of the articles are like 10,000 words, and people need to be engaged in that. I think that's very important. And if I can just do a little bit to help with an interpretation of what the fairies might be, then I think I've done relatively well.
You've spoken about your experiences previously. When you say that you are trying to sort of make head or tail of what they are contacting or communicating with us for, and how they're doing it and why, is that based on your own experiences, or is it based on what you're learning from elsewhere?
Well, both, without a doubt. I mean, certainly most of the articles that I'm writing for the blog site or websites or whatever I'm writing for will use other people's experiences, wherever they come from, however well documented they are or not documented. You try to piece that together and get it under the skin of what might be going on with those other people. But more recently, I've felt more able to talk about my own direct experiences. We're coming back to that direct knowledge, that gnosis of experiencing something firsthand. And, well, I've been doing various podcasts over the last year or so where I've suddenly felt more able to talk about this. Again, we might be talking about the snowball effect, where 3 years ago I didn't tell anyone about what's going on and what I've experienced, whereas now it's a little bit more acceptable, and people aren't going to send round members from the psychiatric ward.
Yeah.
And this goes back a long way. It goes back to the 90s when I had the first experience of a fairy. And I've talked about this various times. I won't go into any great detail about it, but the bottom line is that I was meditating in a place called West Kennet Longbarrow, which is in Wiltshire, in the southwest of the UK. And it's basically a 5,000 plus year old burial chamber, but a burial chamber that would have been used for other purposes. And it was excavated in the 50s. So you can actually go in to this kind of underground, it's not underground, but it seems to be underground chamber at the front of this long barrow. Right. And again, this is back in the 90s, late 90s. And I meditated in the main chamber of the barrow, and experienced a fairy walking up the passageway towards me. The experience lasting about 10 seconds, and the fairy very much in the style of a Brian Froud fairy. Now, it was extremely real. It was hyper real. I hadn't taken any drugs, hadn't been drinking. It was just purely I'd been meditating for maybe 10 minutes before that happened. And since then, as I've discussed various times before, I'm thinking there's an element of me being predisposed to seeing a Froud fairy. I'd been reading Froud, looking at his illustrations for several years by then. And so if a non-human intelligent entity of whatever sort turned up at that place at that time and interacted with me, I think I was predisposed to see it as that. Whatever it really was, it may have just been an energy form. It could be an alien, a ghost, whatever you might like to describe an esoteric experience or an esoteric entity. That's how it formed. That's how it coded itself for me to see at that point. And since then, there's been a lot of very similar type experiences. Some of them on the back of psychotropic drugs, but more recently, it has been on the back of something called Charles Bonnet syndrome.
Yes.
So I lost some of my eyesight, quite a bit of my eyesight, in 2015, and very traumatic experience. I had to leave my job. I had to come to terms with I couldn't drive anymore. Lots of other things I couldn't do. It's been very difficult for me to be able to cope with that. Yeah. And very months after that eyesight became such a problem, I started to experience what most people would call hallucinations. And if you go onto any Charles Bonnet information page, and there's a couple of support groups, they will always just say you're hallucinating. You're not going insane. It's purely your brain trying to make up for your sight loss.
It's now, such a
well, it's such a
makes sense at all.
Well, it's just a reductionist thing. So these forums and the NHS site, etc. Whoever's giving you advice are obliged to come from a reductionist perspective, materialistic perspective, because if they didn't, they would be admitting that there is something beyond reality. Yeah. And they can't do it. I kind of understand why they can't do it. But having experienced this directly, these are not hallucinations. There is contact there. There's a telepathic contact. Again, the hyper reality of those situations, those interfaces with whatever these entities are. Other people with Charles Bonnet syndrome describe a wide remit of types. That sometimes they see cartoon children, they will see animals, they will sometimes just see globes of light, geometric patterns. There's a wide variety of forms, but there are quite a sizable percentage of them will see what I would think of as fairy-like entities. And the ones that I see with my Charles Bonnet syndrome are definitely fairy-like entities. And again, is that just me? coding them to my expectations. Something is there with me in the room for whatever reason. And when I perceive them, they manifest as a Froude type fairy. That's how they manifest.
Yeah.
But if I were someone else, if I knew nothing about fairies, would they be manifesting as something else? I think that's really interesting to try and to get to the bottom of. But you'll only get to the bottom of it by carrying out by dropping the reductionism, opening your mind, and thinking, right, these are not part of what we think of as consensus reality. They are something else, and they're coming from somewhere else, wherever that may be. Maybe within our collective consciousness, maybe a standalone reality. Wherever they're coming from, they're there at that moment, and you need to try and come to terms with that and understand it. That's the way I see it, anyway.
Yeah. Have you found that there's any pattern with the communication with them? I mean, over time, like for instance, did you get eye contact with the first fairy in West Kennet?
Yes, that was one of the most astounding things. It wasn't just seeing like a 2D image in that barrow. He came marching up the passageway looking directly at me. Like I say, there was no audio communication that time. One of the slightly frustrating things about all of the experiences over the years is that there's a very little development arc there. It's not as though I'm being led towards greater and greater knowledge, and they're certainly not telling me, the meaning of life or anything such as that.
Right.
The communication is, I would suggest, always telepathic, and always something along the lines of stop being so anxious. Because certainly since the eyesight failure 5-6 years ago, I've had quite high levels of anxiety. Of
course, yeah.
Which is, maybe a natural attribute of the trauma that the eyesight loss caused. And so they're always, I was going to say they're always friendly. Sometimes they're friendly, sometimes they're indifferent, or that's the way they seem.
Yeah, yeah.
But whenever they do contact me, and that's less than 50% of the times, usually it's just visual. Whenever they contact me, it's always along those lines, stay calm. And once, I think the second manifestation under Charles Bonnet syndrome in 2016, one of them said it in Spanish, which is mantén la calma. I don't speak Spanish, but I remembered the term, and it took me ages to find out that means in Spanish, stay calm, don't worry about it.
Wow.
And so make of that, I still haven't worked out an interpretation for that, although I did slip it cunningly into
I was going to say, I do remember. You got
to make the most of these
absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So there's no particular pattern as such, but it's led you on a path, if you like, because the more that you have experienced this, the more you're able to investigate it and be able to give a commentary for other people who are interested in the matter as well.
That's right. And once you've experienced it, especially when you experience it multiple times, there's no doubt in your mind. You are able to understand it at another level than someone who has never had that type of experience. And that certainly helps me write and talk about these type of experiences. And when I hear someone else talk about a similar type experience, my first, people do this for various reasons, don't they? And you've always got to make sure they're trustworthy. They're not just making it up. They're not deluded or doing it for any other reason. Once you've satisfied yourself that is the case, you can just listen to them, and you've got an open mind enough to think, right, that's similar to my experience or dissimilar in this way, but it's a numinous experience of something outside of consensus reality. It's interesting, and I want to investigate it further. I think that's the interesting thing about the podcasts that you've been putting out is much more in-your-face way of getting the information across, rather than an article. In an article, you can talk about it at length and you can put all the references in, but people will be more, I think, more liable to listen to these podcasts and take it in, especially if they're unfamiliar with this type of phenomena.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And once, from my perspective, because I've experienced these things directly multiple times, I'm able to listen to these people and think, yeah, that's interesting. That's similar to my experience, or that's dissimilar, or this is similar to something else I've heard about. And there does seem to be, although they're all different experiences, they do seem to come together to me. If you listen to all the episodes 1 to 11, there is various common factors which seem to tie in, which to me suggests that we're talking about the same phenomena, whether it's the chap seeing the sticky tree human, or the lady seeing the children in the Dutch Holloway.
Oh yeah.
With the kind of old-fashioned clothes on. And then there's a couple of episodes with what I would think of as time slips, which is another common fairy motif.
Yes.
They all start to come together, and you can always go back to the folklore and look at various folklore motifs and say, yeah, there's that one. Or these stories in the podcast, what I'm saying is they would fit into the Arne Thompson motif index.
It's
perfectly.
True. You're right. I kind of started, I'm coming at it from my own experience and a massive interest in the folklore. And I feel exactly the same when I'm speaking to my guests in the podcast. I'm kind of like, oh, yes, that's exactly how I felt, or that's how it was for me. And it feels so good to be able to just talk about it to people. When I'm chatting to people on the podcast, I don't usually know the full story of what it is that they've seen. It might just be that I know that they have had some fairy experience, and then we have a chat, and that's what the podcast is recording.
That it's interesting, and once again, with all of the podcasts, there was very little fear involved with these encounters. There's a couple of what the chap who described seeing the gnome on his bed when he was a child, but I think that's he was a child, and he was afraid for that. With most of the adult encounters, it's either funny, they feel benevolent, or it's just interesting. It's just, my goodness, what is going on? And I think that's quite important, actually, because that also connects with, I'm thinking about Simon Young and the Fairy Investigation Society census from a few years ago, where out of those 500 experiences, that seemed to be the case. There wasn't much fear there.
No.
It was always people being interested in it, and this does sort of go against most of the folklore, where as you know as well as I, most people were terrified of the fairies, and they were to be avoided at all costs. So that's interesting. That
is so interesting to me, and I really want to look at that more. I really, were that just what they were told to? Were they just told to be frightened? And where did that come from? There's this whole relationship with the church and demons, and I think it really needs looking at more closely, and that this is why it's so great to have people talking about it now, because it isn't something that we need to be frightened of. It's in my mind, in my feeling, is that this is all part of nature. It's kind of the dark. It's almost the dark side of nature, not in a frightening dark side of nature way, but in the shadow of nature, the depths of nature, the part of nature that we just haven't yet met in a way that we fully understand.
Well, that's interesting that you talk in that way, in that a lot of people will correlate absolutely the fairies with nature spirits. And although there's a little bit of controversy, again, as you will know, amongst folklorists about fairies are not nature spirits. But from my viewpoint, from research I've done, again, I would say these entities are all coming from the same place and simply manifesting in slightly different forms under certain circumstances. And because of our increased awareness of perhaps the environmental issues of the 20th, 21st century,
yes,
we're more liable to experience the nature spirits. It's your dark, deep nature trying to communicate with us. Whatever that communication is, and whether we can understand it is another issue. But they are coming. A lot of the examples in that Fairy Investigation Society census, as well as your podcasts and a lot on the Facebook page, are people talking about what you would usually think of as nature spirits, and they will even describe them as nature spirits. And of course, that goes back a long way. It goes back to Paracelsus in the 16th century and the Theosophist movement in the 20th century, who were talking about exactly that same thing. Rudolf Steiner talks extensively about how these nature spirits are fundamental to the natural world, and without them, the natural world will not exist as it has done. So, there's a long history behind this, but I think there's been an upsurge in people experiencing these entities where the interface is such that they see them as nature spirits.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point you make about the issues we're experiencing with threat to our environments globally, that their voice is getting louder, and I do wonder whether they're reaching out to us. Are we reaching into them, or are they reaching out to us? Or maybe it's a bit of both. But
I think it's a bit of both for sure.
It does feel like,
works both ways.
Yeah. Well, I in on good days, I like to think that it feels as if we're pointing in the right direction. That this is a positive symptom of humanity, that we are reconnecting, and I also think when the folklore was being collected in the 19th century, that was at a time of great industrialization, and we are going through another period like that now with a kind of digital evolution. And I just wonder also whether they pop up at times like this. I mean, it's certainly absolutely true that the environment is being threatened. Their environment is being threatened. Well, they are the earth. They are part of earth in some way that we don't really quite understand yet. But they are part and parcel of the earth, as we are.
Yeah, and I think that depends on, you can come at that from like a material perspective, looking at us as organisms and the earth as a giant organism of which we're a part, which is certainly true to a certain extent. But I'm thinking more in terms of consciousness. The idea that consciousness is primary and materiality is secondary. So everything is being created by consciousness. And,
yes, I agree.
And if they are a part of a greater consciousness along with ours, our collective consciousness, maybe that change that is happening now, and it's been happening, for decades now, explains why there may be an upsurge in the interfacing between whatever they are and our consciousness. But I think it's at a consciousness level that we need to look at this. So whenever I see, I know you think the same way about this. Whenever I see people taking photographs of fairies, I'm not completely ruling it out, but I do not believe that you can capture them within materiality. We are experiencing them, as we said right at the beginning, through an altered state of consciousness that plugs into something beyond how we are experiencing the electromagnetic spectrum. It's just that's the way it works.
Yes.
So you can't photograph them, you can't capture them and put them in a glass case. They appear at certain times for certain reasons in certain places, but it's only within our consciousness that we can interact with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of, photographs, and I know they provide a lot of meaning for people, but that it's exactly that. It's what they have perceived with their own eyes and then taken a picture of it, or maybe they've been using their camera and looked at the photo afterwards. But I think the important point there is, what did it mean to them? Mm-hmm. It's a personal thing. It's something that they have experienced, and it's what did it mean to them? And so that photograph can be meaningful to them. But I agree, it doesn't capture what you can't. I don't believe you can take photographs of fairies. I don't.
I think that's a really important point. It's the event rather than the thing. So when they took that photograph, they may have been looking at an entity of whatever type. What then comes out on that material photograph is not that entity.
No.
But that doesn't mean the event didn't happen. The obvious one is the Cottingley fairies, isn't it?
Sure.
Where, they were faked, but the elder girl, I forget the elder girl's name. Frances is the eldest one, isn't she? And later in life, when they were being questioned about it, she was saying, "Oh yeah, we did fake them, but there were fairies there," and that's very important. They were trying to manifest in that way what they were experiencing, and that for anyone taking a photo of what they think of as a fairy, they're trying to manifest that, and it's the event that is important, not the end product of that photograph, which to my mind will never show a non-human intelligent entity that is not usually working within the electromagnetic spectrum.
And I suppose it's a way of kind of maybe it's a way of sort of showing the world, look, they're true. But I think people are only ever going to be ready to open themselves up to this fact that they do in fact exist as part of an alternate reality. If people aren't ready for that's not our business to tell them otherwise. It's not. But coming back to the one of our original points is that there are many more people now open to the idea that this type of idea, that this phenomenon might exist in some shape or form, than even a couple of decades ago, because of that quick spread of information via the internet. I think it's the most important way that's happened. Well, it will be really interesting to seeing as all this activities happened in the last sort of 3 to 5 years, and particularly this year, what happens in the next 5 years, because, who knows really, but I am quite excited to see where these investigations go. And I think Simon Young's census is still running as well. So this will be 2018 is it still running, or he aims to publish the new census either later this year or maybe at the start of next year. That's the last time I talked to him. That's really exciting. It is. It's a great resource, and it's great to read these descriptions, some of which are absolutely amazing. And really you get the impression that a few of them may be wind-ups. Mm-hmm. But you get the definite impression that most of these people are just telling with as much integrity as possible what they've experienced, in the same way as the people on your podcast have done. Well, thank you very much, Neil. It's really, really good to talk, and must have a chat again and at some point, and reassess the landscape in terms of the Fae, and Yeah, I do feel quite excited about things. I feel like there's definitely something happening. I don't know what that is, but certainly the podcast, which started as an idea because I just was not getting round to doing my PhD, and I was having had a baby, finding,
Excuses.
Yeah. Finding very little time for writing the book. But the podcast, when it came up through meditation, the idea came for that during lockdown, and really strong. And I thought, how am I going to do a podcast? I don't know how to do a podcast. Next minute, I'm doing a podcast, but this is so much energy behind it. It really has got its own momentum.
Well, they are excellent, and it's like I say, it's a brilliant way to get this type of information over to people, especially in those nice. They're usually about 30 minutes, aren't they?
Yeah.
And people, well, you know what people are like. If it's over an hour, I'm not listening to that. Whereas 30 minutes, you can listen to it in the car, or you can just, fit it into your day quite easily.
Yeah.
And they're very, very useful for helping people try to understand the phenomenon.
They are, and I think fundamentally for people like you and I who have actually had experiences, to hear other people talk about theirs is just everything. I mean, it just really, really helps. I'm really glad you enjoy them too. I love them. I really enjoy it. And let us know when your next project's going on, and we can check into your page at Dead But Dreaming. It's deadbutdreaming.wordpress.com.
That's it, yeah.
And the Fairy Code on Facebook.
That's right. The Fairy Code tends to just anything I find useful, whether it's articles or artwork, good artwork, anything fairy related, I will stick it up there, and it tends to get quite a good coverage.
Oh, cool. And I'll put a load of links anyway on my show notes. But thanks very much, Neil, for joining me, and speak soon.
Thank you very much, Joe. I really enjoyed it.
Time to
That was so great to catch up with Neil. He's got some amazing insight into this area and some really, really interesting perspectives and points of view. There are so many angles to take, but they all lead back to the same point, that people like you and I see fairies, and that at present we just don't have the understanding to fully explain it. I like that there is now so much information out there about this subject. I've provided some links to other recent interviews that Neil has given where he provides a deeper dive on some of the topics that we discussed, such as the Charles Bonnet syndrome and the study of psychotropics, the visual imagery that they result in, and how these resemble the reports of fairy sightings. Just a note for you fact checkers who are about to email me or tweet me, we did mention the two girls in the Cottingley Fairies incident, and while Frances was the one that maintained they'd seen fairies, she was actually the younger of the two, but perhaps the more outspoken one. This being the last episode, I'm now taking a 2-month break to catch up with interviews in preparation for Series 2, which I'll begin on June 13th. But here is the thing. If you've been listening and you enjoy the show, I want you to get involved. And I want to hear what you love about the show, what you'd like to hear more of, less of, and any other aspects of fairy encounters that you'd like us to explore together. As regular listeners will know, this show is created for people to share their experiences, but also, very importantly, for others who've had their own encounters to know that they're not the only ones. Personally, the first time I saw a fairy, I wasn't prepared for it, and I didn't have anyone to immediately discuss it with. This experience forms the basis of my initial interest. I haven't yet told my own story, so on my birthday this year, May the 4th, yes, I am a Beltane baby, I'd like to share with you a special bonus episode where I can tell you about my own experience and how it eventually led to the creation of this podcast. During the show, I'll also be revealing how you can get involved with shaping the next series by joining me for a group discussion. So stick May the 4th in your diary, and I hope to meet with you and hear your ideas. Thanks so much to all you listeners who've joined me on this, our initial expedition together into the unknown. It feels so good to know that you're with me. We're learning all the time, and we continue seeking with love in our hearts so that we always remain curious.